Marcus Johnson, a wealthy and respected African-American businessman, sat in his opulent study as his personal physician delivered the news. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson, but the tests confirm a terminal condition. You have about 6 months left." Marcus nodded, his face betraying no emotion. As the doctor left, he turned to face the floor-to-ceiling mirror behind his desk. His reflection stared back at him. A man in his early 50s, fit and well-groomed, the very picture of success. Yet now, faced with his mortality, Marcus found himself questioning the true value of his achievements. His empire, built from nothing, suddenly seemed hollow. What really mattered in life? Who would stand by him in his final months? That evening, Marcus called for a family dinner. His wife Vanessa, a striking woman in her 40s, and his stepson Jake, a handsome young man in his late 20s, arrived promptly. The atmosphere was tense as they sat down to eat in the formal dining room. Marcus cleared his throat. "I have something important to tell you both," he began, his voice steady. "I've received some bad news from my doctor. I have a terminal illness. I only have about 6 months left." The room fell silent. Vanessa's fork clattered onto her plate. Jake's eyes widened in shock. Marcus watched their reactions closely, searching for genuine concern, love, or perhaps relief. Vanessa reached out and grasped Marcus's hand. "Oh, darling," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll face this together. Whatever you need, we're here for you." Jake nodded in agreement, his face a mask of concern. As the meal progressed, Marcus observed his family. They spoke of treatments, comfort measures, and making the most of the time left. On the surface, everything seemed as it should be, a family rallying around their dying patriarch. Yet something nagged at Marcus. A fleeting glance between Vanessa and Jake, quickly averted. A moment of tension when hands accidentally brushed while reaching for the salt. Tiny details that most would miss, but that Marcus, with his keen eye for human nature, couldn't help but notice. As they finished dessert, Marcus excused himself, claiming fatigue. He retreated to his study, leaving Vanessa and Jake alone. From the hallway, he caught a glimpse of them through a partially open door. They were standing close, too close for comfort. Jake's hand rested on Vanessa's waist, and she leaned into him slightly. Marcus turned away, his mind reeling. He had always prided himself on his judgment of character, on building a loyal family. Now, faced with his impending death, he was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps he didn't know his family as well as he thought he did. The following day, Marcus's sister Angela arrived at the mansion. She swept into the living room, her designer outfit and perfectly coiffed hair a stark contrast to Marcus's weary appearance. "Oh, Marcus," she exclaimed, embracing him. "I came as soon as I heard. How are you holding up?" Her voice was filled with concern, but Marcus noticed a flicker of something else in her eyes. As Angela settled into an armchair, Marcus updated her on his condition. He watched her face carefully, noting the mix of emotions that played across it. Concern, yes, but also a hint of calculation. "And what about your affairs?" Angela asked, her tone delicate. "Have you sorted everything out? The business, the estate?" For a brief moment, a look of naked envy crossed Angela's face. It was gone in an instant, replaced by sisterly concern, but Marcus had seen it. He'd always known his sister resented his success to some degree, but he hadn't realized how deep that resentment ran. "Everything's in order," Marcus replied smoothly, revealing nothing. Later that day, Marcus overheard a hushed conversation between Vanessa and Jake in the garden. Hidden behind a large topiary, he listened intently. "We can't keep this up," Vanessa was saying, her voice strained. "With Marcus's condition?" "I know," Jake replied, his tone frustrated. "But I can't just turn off my feelings, Vanessa. What we have, it's not just physical. I love you." Marcus felt his heart constrict. He'd suspected something was off, but hearing it confirmed was another matter entirely. Vanessa sighed heavily. "I love you too, Jake, but I'm married to Marcus. He's dying. How can we?" "We'll figure it out," Jake said softly. "We always do." Marcus retreated silently, his mind whirling. His wife and stepson were having an affair. Not just a fling, but a full-blown emotional entanglement. And now, faced with his impending death, they were struggling with their guilt. As he walked back to the house, Marcus pondered his next move. Should he confront them? Or wait and see how this played out? His initial instinct was to explode with anger, to throw them both out. But the businessman in him, the strategist, urged caution. He needed more information. He needed to understand the full scope of this betrayal. And most importantly, he needed to know who else might be involved. If his wife and stepson could deceive him so thoroughly, who else in his life might be wearing a mask? Marcus resolved to watch and wait. He would observe, gather information, and then decide how to proceed. After all, he had built an empire by being patient and strategic. Now, it seemed, he would need those skills not in the boardroom, but in his own home. A few days later, Marcus invited his childhood friend David over for dinner. As they sat in Marcus's private study, the weight of recent revelations hung heavy in the air. "David, I need to talk to someone I can trust," Marcus began, his usual confident demeanor faltering slightly. "Things aren't what they seem in my family." David leaned forward, concern etched on his face. "What's going on, Marcus?" Marcus took a deep breath and recounted everything. His fake terminal diagnosis, the overheard conversation between Vanessa and Jake, and Angela's barely concealed avarice. As he spoke, Marcus felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and deep-seated insecurity washing over him. "I've built this empire, David. I've given them everything, and this is how they repay me?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "Am I a fool for trusting them?" David listened intently, his brow furrowed in thought. When Marcus finished, David was silent for a moment before speaking. "Marcus, you've always been a strategic thinker. Why not apply that to this situation?" David suggested. "You've started a test of loyalty without even realizing it. Why not see it through?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "Continue with this charade of being terminally ill," David explained. "Watch how they behave when they think you're dying. Their true colors will show, for better or worse." The idea took root in Marcus's mind. It was manipulative, perhaps even cruel, but it appealed to his strategic nature. He nodded slowly. "You're right, David. I need to know the truth, all of it, before I make any decisions." As David left that evening, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would turn this situation to his advantage, using it to uncover the true nature of those around him. Yet, as he prepared for bed that night, doubt crept in. Was he doing the right thing? The weight of the deception he was about to undertake settled on his shoulders. He was about to manipulate the emotions of those closest to him, to test their loyalty in the cruelest way possible. For a moment, Marcus considered calling it off, coming clean about his fake diagnosis, and confronting Vanessa and Jake directly. But then he remembered the look of calculation in Angela's eyes, the hushed conversation in the garden. No, he decided. He needed to know the full extent of their betrayal. As he drifted off to sleep, Marcus steeled himself for what was to come. He had built his empire by making tough decisions and seeing them through. Now, he would apply that same ruthless determination to his personal life. Whatever the outcome, he would face the truth head-on. A week after his conversation with David, Marcus decided to put his plan into action. He arranged another family dinner, this time inviting Angela as well. As they gathered around the ornate dining table, Marcus began his performance. He picked at his food, occasionally wincing as if in pain. When Vanessa asked if he was all right, he waved off her concern with a forced smile. "Just a bad day," he muttered, his voice weaker than usual. Throughout the meal, Marcus observed his family's reactions. Vanessa's brow furrowed with worry, but he caught her exchanging quick, meaningful glances with Jake. Angela, meanwhile, kept steering the conversation towards Marcus's business affairs. "Have you thought about who will take over the company, brother?" Angela asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. Marcus feigned a coughing fit to avoid answering immediately. When he recovered, he noticed Jake leaning towards Vanessa, his hand briefly touching hers under the table. "I'm still considering my options," Marcus finally replied, his voice hoarse. He saw a flash of disappointment cross Angela's face. As the dinner progressed, Marcus's erratic behavior intensified. He switched between moments of lucidity and confusion, testing how his family would react. Vanessa appeared genuinely concerned, but there was an undercurrent of tension in her interactions with Jake that Marcus couldn't ignore. After dessert, Marcus announced he needed to speak with everyone. The atmosphere in the room immediately became charged with anticipation and anxiety. "I've been thinking a lot about the future," Marcus began, his voice deliberately unsteady. "About what will happen to all of you when I'm gone." He paused, watching their reactions. Vanessa reached out to take his hand, her face a mask of sympathy. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Angela leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with barely concealed interest. "I want to make sure you're all taken care of," Marcus continued, "but I need to know I can trust you. All of you." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus could almost see the wheels turning in their heads, each of them wondering what he knew, what he suspected. "What do you mean, darling?" Vanessa asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marcus locked eyes with each of them in turn. "I mean that in these last months of my life, I need to know who truly has my best interests at heart, who I can rely on to carry on my legacy." The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus saw panic flicker across Jake's face, guilt in Vanessa's eyes, and a calculating look from Angela. "I think it's time we all had an honest conversation," Marcus declared, his voice suddenly stronger. "No more secrets. No more lies." As his words hung in the air, Marcus prepared himself for the confrontation to come. He had set the stage, and now it was time for the truth to be revealed, no matter how painful it might be. The room fell silent as Marcus's words sank in. He fixed his gaze on Vanessa and Jake, who seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. "Let's start with you two," Marcus said, his voice cold and steady. "How long has this been going on?" Vanessa's face paled. "What are you talking about, Marcus?" "Don't insult my intelligence," Marcus snapped. "I know about your affair with Jake, my own wife and stepson. How could you?" Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "It's not what you think, Marcus. We never meant to dash." "To what?" Marcus interrupted. "To fall in love? To betray me? To wait for me to die so you could be together?" Vanessa burst into tears. "Marcus, please. We never wanted to hurt you. It just happened." The room crackled with tension. Angela sat silently, her eyes darting between the three of them, clearly trying to gauge how this revelation might affect her own interests. "How long?" Marcus demanded again. Jake slumped back into his chair. 2 years, he admitted quietly. Marcus felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. 2 years. Half of his marriage had been a lie. "I trusted you," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me?" Jake leaned forward, his face earnest. "Marcus, you have to believe me. What Vanessa and I have, it's real. We love each other." "Love?" Marcus scoffed. "You call this love? Sneaking around, lying, waiting for me to die?" Vanessa reached out to touch Marcus's arm, but he jerked away. "Marcus, we never wished for your death. When you told us about your diagnosis, we were devastated." "Oh, I'm sure you were," Marcus replied sarcastically. "Devastated that your plan to wait me out was ruined." "It wasn't like that," Jake protested. "We were going to tell you. We just dash." "Just what?" Marcus interrupted. "Waiting for the right moment? There is no right moment to tell a man you've betrayed him." Angela, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "Marcus, you need to expose them. Make this public. They don't deserve your protection." Marcus turned to his sister, his eyes narrowing. "And what about you, Angela? What's your angle in all this?" Angela's face fell, realizing she had overplayed her hand. The room fell silent again, the air thick with unspoken accusations and shattered trust. Marcus stood up, looking at each of them in turn. "I think I've heard enough for tonight. I need time to process this betrayal." As he turned to leave, Marcus felt the weight of years of deception crushing down on him. He had started this confrontation seeking the truth, but now that he had it, he wasn't sure what to do with it. Marcus retreated to his study, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The muffled sounds of arguments from the dining room faded as he sank into his leather chair. His eyes fell on a collection of framed photographs on his desk, happy moments frozen in time, now tainted by the knowledge of betrayal. He picked up a photo of Vanessa on their wedding day, her smile radiant and seemingly genuine. Had it all been a lie from the start? Another frame held a picture of Jake's college graduation, Marcus's arm proudly around his stepson's shoulders. The memory of that day, once cherished, now felt hollow. As Marcus stared at these snapshots of a life he thought he knew, a wave of emotions washed over him. Anger, hurt, disappointment, but also a profound sense of loss. Not just for the relationships he thought he had, but for the future he had envisioned. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was David, concern etched on his face. "I heard raised voices," David said, closing the door behind him. "I take it the confrontation didn't go well?" Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "That's an understatement. They admitted to a 2-year affair. David, 2 years of lies, right under my nose." David sat down across from Marcus, his expression sympathetic but measured. "And how do you feel about that?" "How do I feel?" Marcus repeated, his voice rising. "I feel like a fool. Like everything I've built, everything I've worked for, has been a sham." David nodded slowly. "That's understandable. But Marcus, you're more than just your relationships with them. Your worth isn't defined by their actions." Marcus fell silent, pondering David's words. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice softer. "You know, despite everything, a part of me wants to forgive them. Is that crazy?" "It's not crazy," David replied. "It's human. Forgiveness isn't about excusing their actions. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of anger and resentment." Marcus leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The idea of forgiveness seemed impossible, yet the thought of carrying this anger and hurt forever was equally unbearable. "I don't know if I can do that, David." "Not yet." David leaned forward, his voice earnest. "You don't have to decide right now. Take your time. Think about what you really want, not just for now, but for your future." As David left, Marcus turned to look out the window at the manicured gardens below. The life he had built, the empire he had created. It all seemed so fragile now. Yet as he watched the sun setting, casting long shadows across the lawn, he felt a glimmer of something new. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. Whatever he decided, whether to forgive or to cut ties completely, Marcus knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. The question now was, what kind of life did he want to build from the ashes of betrayal? The next morning, Marcus woke early, his mind already racing with plans. He'd spent most of the night weighing his options, and while he wasn't ready to forgive, he also wasn't prepared to make any rash decisions. He needed more time, more information, and most importantly, he needed to protect himself and his assets. Marcus called his lawyer and scheduled a discreet meeting for later that day. He then reached out to a few trusted business associates, arranging a series of meetings under the guise of discussing his succession plans. In reality, he wanted to gauge who he could truly rely on outside of his immediate family. At the office, Marcus threw himself into work with renewed vigor. His employees noticed a change in him, a new intensity, a sharper focus. In meetings, he was more decisive than ever, closing deals and making bold strategic moves. "Are you feeling all right, Mr. Johnson?" his assistant asked, concern evident in her voice. Marcus managed a tight smile. "Never better," he replied, even as his mind churned with thoughts of betrayal and revenge. As the day progressed, Marcus found himself constantly checking his phone, half expecting messages from Vanessa or Jake. But there was nothing. Their silence spoke volumes, and Marcus felt a mix of relief and disappointment. Returning home that evening, Marcus braced himself for another confrontation, but the house was quiet. He found a note from Vanessa saying she was staying with a friend to give him space. Jake was nowhere to be seen. Alone in the vast house, Marcus felt a strange sense of liberation. Without the constant reminders of his family's betrayal, he could think more clearly about his next steps. He poured himself a drink and settled into his study, pulling out the notes he'd made during his meetings that day. As he reviewed his plans, a new resolve settled over him. He would not be a victim in this situation. He would take control, protect what was his, and emerge stronger. Just as he was about to call it a night, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Jake. "Can we talk? I want to explain." Marcus stared at the message, his finger hovering over the reply button. Part of him wanted to hear Jake out, to understand how his stepson could betray him so deeply. Another part wanted to cut all ties and never speak to him again. In the end, Marcus put the phone down without replying. He wasn't ready for that conversation yet. He needed more time to prepare, to shore up his defenses, both emotional and financial. As he headed to bed, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, hurt, but also a growing sense of determination. Whatever came next, he would face it on his own terms. The game had changed, and Marcus was determined to come out on top, no matter the cost. A week after the confrontation, Marcus decided it was time to bring everything to a head. He sent out a group message to Vanessa, Jake, and Angela, calling for a family meeting the following evening. The responses were immediate, a flurry of anxious texts asking what this was about. Marcus ignored them all. The day of the meeting, Marcus met with David for lunch. They sat in a quiet corner of an upscale restaurant, away from prying ears. "Are you sure about this, Marcus?" David asked, concern evident in his voice. "Once you do this, there's no going back." Marcus nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'm sure. I need to know the full truth, and they need to face the consequences of their actions." David leaned back, studying his friend. "And what about you? Are you prepared for the fallout?" For a moment, Marcus's resolve wavered. The thought of losing his family, dysfunctional as it was, still pained him, but he pushed the feeling aside. "I have to be," he said firmly. As they parted ways, David clasped Marcus's shoulder. "Whatever happens, I'm here for you." Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon in his study, reviewing documents and rehearsing what he would say. As evening approached, he heard the front door open and close several times. They were arriving. At precisely 7 p.m., Marcus made his way to the living room. Vanessa, Jake, and Angela were already there, seated awkwardly around the room. The tension was palpable. Vanessa stood as Marcus entered. "Marcus, I dash." He held up a hand, silencing her. "Not yet. We'll all have a chance to speak." Marcus took his seat, facing the three of them. He could see the anxiety on their faces, the fear of what was to come. "Good," he thought. "Let them squirm. I've called you here because it's time for the truth to come out," Marcus began, his voice steady and controlled. "All of it. No more lies, no more secrets." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Angela's eyes darted between Marcus and the others, clearly trying to gauge the situation. "For years, I believed I had a loyal family," Marcus continued. "I thought I could trust you all, but recent events have shown me how wrong I was." He paused, letting his words sink in. The silence in the room was deafening. "So here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, leaning forward. "Each of you will have a chance to explain yourselves, to tell me everything, and I mean everything, you've been hiding. And then, I'll decide what happens next." Marcus sat back, his eyes moving from one face to another. "Who wants to go first?" The room remained silent, the air thick with unspoken words and hidden truths. Marcus waited, knowing that soon, everything would change. For better or worse, the truth would finally come out. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, Vanessa spoke, her voice trembling. "Marcus, I don't know where to begin," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "How about the truth?" Marcus replied coldly. "For once." Vanessa took a deep breath. "The affair with Jake? It started 2 years ago. We never meant for it to happen. It was just, we were both feeling lonely and dash." "Lonely?" Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. "You were lonely in a marriage to a man who gave you everything?" Jake leaned forward, his face a mask of guilt and defiance. "It wasn't about the money, Marcus. Vanessa and we connected on a deeper level." Marcus laughed bitterly. "A deeper level? How poetic. And I suppose this deep connection justified lying to me for years." Angela, sensing an opportunity, chimed in. "This is disgraceful. They've been making a fool of you, Marcus. You need to dash. Be quiet, Angela, Marcus snapped. Your turn will come. He turned back to Vanessa and Jake. I want to know everything. Every lie, every secret meeting, every plan you made behind my back. Over the next hour, the truth spilled out. The clandestine meetings, the whispered phone calls, the elaborate lies to cover their tracks. With each revelation, Marcus felt his heart hardening. And when I told you about my terminal illness? Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Vanessa lowered her head. We talked about coming clean then, but we were afraid of hurting you in your final months. How considerate, Marcus said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He then turned to Angela. And you? What's your role in all this? Angela straightened, trying to look innocent. I had no idea about their affair, Marcus. I'm as shocked as you are. Really? Marcus raised an eyebrow. So you weren't planning to use this situation to your advantage? To position yourself to take over my company? Angela's face fell, realizing she'd been caught. I was just trying to protect your legacy, brother. Marcus stood up, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the room. Enough. I've heard enough lies to last a lifetime. He walked to his desk and pulled out a folder. I had my suspicions, so I did some digging. I have proof of everything. The affair, Angela's schemes, all of it. The color drained from their faces as Marcus continued. I also have this. He held up a small recording device. Every word of this meeting has been recorded. Vanessa gasped. Jake put his head in his hands. Angela looked like she might faint. So here's what's going to happen, Marcus said, his voice cold and businesslike. I'm going to take some time to decide what to do with this information. In the meantime, you'll all leave this house. Tonight. As they stood to leave, shell-shocked and defeated, Marcus felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, but also a strange sense of relief. The truth was finally out, and now he could begin to rebuild his life on his own terms.